The Germany of Siegfried, of mythical heroes and the barbaric splendor of all that goes with war, but the foretaste of defeat. Was this myth that Hitler had given his people all that they now had left to back their pledge to him in return? My Führer, the West Wall stands and will hold, come what may. The 58th volume of the United States Army's History of World War II is entitled The Siegfried Line Campaign by Charles B. MacDonald. It covers the fierce fighting along the German frontier near the city of Aachen in the fall and early winter of the year 1944. The story of the Siegfried Line campaign takes place in northern Germany. It is the story of savage combat by small units against a tenacious enemy, formidable defenses, inhospitable terrain, supply problems, and weather as hostile as any enemy threat. There was no mistaking that frontier. Like those legendary dragon's teeth that sprang from the earth as armed men, its anti-tank obstacles stretched in a ribbon of mute sentries uncoiled across the quiet countryside. Built in the late 30s, the myth of the Third Reich was built into those dragon's teeth, drawing the face of Germany in a grimace of defiant scorn for a world at peace. Now the years of war were passing elsewhere, and the neglected line, with its empty fortifications, was becoming part of a landscape where earth and myth merged into one, as that summer now merged into fall. And with fall, the Allied threat came at last, its armies sweeping the enemy before them across Europe like leaves are swept before a vengeful wind. But confidence, not vengeance, was what lit the faces in General Courtney Hodges' First Army. What was a myth to men who had landed at Normandy on D-Day, made the break from the beachhead, and liberated Paris? After moving at unprecedented speeds, all three corps of the First Army readied to thrust into Germany, assured that even the frontier would scarcely check the enemy's retreat before them. It was the 7th Corps, under General J. Lawton Collins, that would set the First Army's pace and make the main effort. In order to breach the Siegfried Line's fortifications before the Germans had a chance to man them, Collins mounted a reconnaissance in force the day after the first patrols had penetrated the frontier. To the north, with only their own tanks to cover them, they attacked across open field, where every step forward was a gamble, over roads alive with mines and villages alive with snipers. Fences and backyards were the only shelter, and too often, no shelter at all. Within 5 days, the 7th Corps had seized the high ground around Aachen. Pierced the forward band of the Siegfried Line along an 11-mile front and penetrated the heavier line of fortifications in 2 places. Now the closest enemy was delay. Every day, every hour of it, General Collins knew, must bring the Germans closer to their defenses. Since July, Hitler himself had taken personal charge of Germany's war. His strategy for the Western Front could now be summed up in 2 words: stand fast. And backing his edict with reinforcements, 15,000 men of the German 12th Infantry Division had reached the Rohr River the night of the 16th and were pouring into the defense positions of the Siegfried Line. They were waiting as the 7th Corps reconnaissance burst into a full-scale attack on the line's main fortifications, extending to the south into the gloom of a forest straight from the German folk tales of the Brothers Grimm, the stifling embrace of its densely interwoven trees obscuring the sky itself. The Huertgen Forest, a name that would come to symbolize the long-drawn heartbreak and despair of war as surely as its fairy tale counterparts had enshrined the nightmares of childhood. On the same day, Hitler's heavy reinforcements appeared to dispute the 7th Corps passage of the Siegfried Line. To the north, over the Netherlands, the whole sky blossomed with parachutes in the war's largest airborne assault. If the Allied Operation Market Garden had succeeded, the Siegfried Line would have been outflanked, ending the Huertgen Forest nightmare almost as soon as it began. But the weather, combined with unexpectedly firm German resistance, to prevent the airborne troops from keeping the foothold over the Rhine that would have set the stage for the drive to Berlin. Again, there was no alternative. The Siegfried Line campaign would have to continue. From the deceptively open country and the villages to the north, down to the shadowy heart of the Huertgen Forest itself, the foot soldiers of the 7th Corps carried their assaults. But for every yard advanced, the next came that much harder. The line had been penetrated, pillboxes captured and destroyed. But of the enemy, an enemy that had fled halfway across Europe and now suddenly turned to fight with a resistance as inexplicable as it was fierce. An enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. In the confusion and uncertain shadows of the thick trees, the only proofs were the prisoners and the dead laid out at peace on the forest floor. "19 days had passed since General Lightning Joe Collins had pierced the first dragon teeth of the Siegfried Line. But now, as September closed around his 7th Corps and those on either side of him, the entire First Army, for the first time since the breakout at the Normandy beachhead, was stopped. Aachen, ancient capital of the Holy Roman Empire, was attacked on October 8th. For 13 days, this shrine to Germany's resplendent history was convulsed in the tumult of modern war. All the vain hopes of the 20th century crowded through streets that had witnessed the serenity of medieval culture and learning, and the coronation of 32 emperors and kings. To the Americans, the surrender of Aachen meant another concentration of enemy resistance wiped from their path. To the returning refugees, evacuated when the order had come for the city's last-ditch defense, in these crumbled ruins lay the still warm ashes of the myth of the Third Reich, dating now not the 1,000 years into the future that Hitler had pledged it, but more than 1,000 years back, to the day when the city had given birth to Charlemagne, Emperor of the West. In terms of war, Aachen now belonged to the past. For the men of the 19th Corps north of Aachen, it was the same yard by yard, man by man struggle toward the Ruhr River and the Cologne Plain that opened to the Rhine. But below Aachen, still lying athwart the entire south wing of General Hodge's First Army, the Huertgen Forest remained uncleared. November came, and with it, the staggering assault delivered by the 28th Division of General Giraud's 5th Corps. But the merciless forest absorbed that wholesale tragic heroism and asked for more. Courage was no match for it, measured in any amount of men. It devoured them and asked for more. It had become a nightmare from which there was no awakening, even as a new enemy joined the old. The worsening weather was an enemy the men could come to grips with, but to almost as little avail. And like the old one, it seemed to become more tenacious as the days passed. The October attack had broken into a series of minor engagements when General Eisenhower determined upon the crushing new offensive that would sweep the entire Western Front. The 9th Army, under General William H. Simpson, was moved in north of Aachen. Day after day, the weather delayed its opening blow until at last, November 16th dawned upon the heaviest air bombardment in direct support of ground troops to be launched in all of World War II. With the British Second Army to the north, the American First and 9th Armies were to drive for the Rhine. Again, the main effort would be made in the Aachen sector as the most direct route to the vital Ruhr industrial area, Germany's arsenal. And there again, it would be made by the 7th Corps. The onslaught did not miss its mark. By now, Germany's war losses in weapons and equipment were so enormous as to defy estimate. The summer months alone had taken over 1 million German casualties, and now new and uncounted numbers pressed the total to nearer 4 million since the war began. Yet they fought back. Their communications shattered, their supply lines smashed. They returned the attack with a ferocity that seemed whetted by their losses. This was no fairy tale. This was no myth. 10,000 tons of bombs had been dropped on the German defenses, but still the Germans replied. From the Allied Supreme Command down to the exhausted GI, it had not even the fairy tale's horrifying logic. It was war. War demanding new men, new courage, and giving nothing in return, but those demands pressed harder. Hopes for the sweeping success of the great November offensive had been swallowed, just as the Huertgen Forest swallowed new reserves and asked for more. It was war that demanded casualties any way it could get them, and the winter became as vicious an enemy as any lurking behind the trees. In the Huertgen Forest, it was war where battle tactics lost their meaning, where gains were still measured in yards, in feet, in dead. Still, they were gains. And while battle strategies might founder, the inexorable rules of war would demand that either advance or retreat must eventually prevail. Even in the Huertgen Forest, one of those must prevail. It was advance. Each unit, each man, advanced on his own terms, trampling the bleak fragments of a myth that fled before every step he took forward, as though it had never existed. As though nothing but cold and mud had ever existed. Beyond the Huertgen Forest, war became human again, but that did not redeem it. And as though there were not already enough desolation and waste and sheer loss of everything to be valued, there was always another engagement, another pocket of desperation, defending what was already lost. The cold, echoing in desolate wastes of roads and towns and people in ruin, the hollow entreaties of defeat. The dragon teeth, the barbed wire and hidden guns of the Siegfried Line were behind, where the Huertgen Forest nightmare lay at last splintered and torn open to what winter sunlight there was. 3 months had passed since the first patrols had pierced that frontier. But even now, these two American armies were barely 22 miles inside Germany. The November offensive was 3 weeks old when the 9th Army reached the Roer River, its swollen waters ready to flood the plain if either side had burst the dams hidden high in the Huertgen Forest. A week later, a long week of hard fighting, because no one could have named its end. The First Army broke through to the Roer River, and the plain opened out toward the Rhine, where hope lay that war, even this war, might end. The Siegfried Line campaign was a part of history, but was it a part, and perhaps, after all, the real part of war?
It is no show place this time. Not wealthy, not well known. Before what happened here in December 1944, or even since. For 7 days, history paused at a crossroads in this Belgian Ardennes village and then passed on. Unless we can call history the echoes that ring in the memories of the men who make it, as they did in the battle at Saint-Vith.
Not much time for sleeping, eating at irregular hours.
The fact was that everyone and every unit was fighting for its own life.
You're going to get it, so maybe this is it.
Colonel, C battery is firing at 150 yards.
Cold. When you're cold, you stay cold. There's no way of getting warm.
We've got no orders to retire.
Und es war nicht möglich, etwa Saint-Vith meinerseits vom deutschen Angriff hier auszusparen.
In the fall of 1944, the German army had been fighting for 5 years. Allied confidence was high, its strength overwhelming, and a halt in its sweep across Europe at the German frontier regarded as temporary. There, the forces of Field Marshal von Rundstedt held desperately, their calls for reinforcements answered by inferior materials or silence. General Siegfried Westphal, von Rundstedt's chief of staff, recalls these days on the Western Front as the most uneasy he had spent, until the day in late October when he learned the reason for the stubborn silence of the Wehrmacht High Command.
Hitler received us and informed us that he was planning a large-scale offensive in the West in the near future. We were going to receive 20 infantry divisions and 10 panzer divisions, newly and completely equipped, and the land operations would be supported by at least 3,000 fighters. The target of this operation, which was to be initiated in the area west and south of Cologne, would be the capture of the fort of Antwerp.
3 German armies would launch the massive counteroffensive to split the Allied forces and capture their best port of supply, Antwerp. What would end as the greatest pitched battle ever fought by American troops, the Battle of the Bulge, would burst without warning on a quiet sector on the First Army front. In December 1944, it was held in the north by the 2nd and 99th Divisions, by the veteran exhausted 28th and the 4th Divisions to the south, and by the newly arrived 106th, thinly spread at the center.
Conditions were fairly miserable. It was intermittently raining and snowing. We were relieving the 2nd Infantry Division. We, as a brand new, young, inexperienced division, were being moved into their position to take up the defense of that particular sector. We were introduced sort of ironically, as I now recall, because most of the battle-tested veterans of the 2nd Infantry Division kept talking to each one of the units of the 106, talking about what a country club area this was to be. You would hear perhaps some few shots fired each day.
The supervision of all preparations was in the hands of von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West. Participants in the attack were the 6th SS Panzer Army under SS Group Commander-in-Chief Dietrich on the right, the 5th Panzer Army under General of the Panzer Force von Manteuffel, and the 7th Army at the left wing under General Brandenberger for coverage in the south. While the operation was being prepared, it was important above all to keep this a secret from the Allied forces. All movements were made during the night only. All vehicles in the front vicinity were wrapped in straw to keep the noise to a minimum. But nobody could predict how the situation would develop by December 16th.
Von Manteuffel, Westphal, von Rundstedt, Model. From the beginning, Hitler's generals saw no guarantee of success for the counteroffensive. But the Fuhrer was adamant. His plan was irrevocable. Its key elements were surprise, speed, and to prevent Allied air cover, bad weather, as specified in this basic order from the Wehrmacht High Command.
The operation will take place only under favorable weather conditions. These will be ordered by the Fuhrer. These sentences induced me to call up headquarters and ironically inquire whether Hitler was now ordering the weather too.
Telefonischen Anfrage beim Hauptquartier, ob Hitler nunmehr auch das Wetter befehlen würde.
The weather did take sides. It was a harsh, confusing enemy to Combat Command B of the 7th Armored Division under General Bruce C. Clark. But the weather was a close ally of 5th Panzer Army Commander General Hasso von Manteuffel.
General, I'm reminded of December 1944 when you and I saw these beautiful green and quiet hills, all covered with haze and mist and turning into rain and mud and snow. And I can't help but think how weather played a very important part in that time, as you knew so well.
Yes. Ich darf daran erinnern, dass es ja ein Hauptplan war von Hitler.
It had been Hitler's plan to start the offensive only during bad weather. And during the days prior to the attack, the weather actually was bad. So that the German High Command was afraid it might change to clear winter weather and blue skies, in which case your aerial combat forces might have stopped the attack in its very early stage. In fact, the weather on December 16 was just as you described it now. Visibility was bad. The advanced artillery observers, for instance, would have not been able to make out individual targets on the hills.
Man konnte nicht sehr weit sehen. Die vorgeschobenen Beobachter der Artillerie hätten beispielsweise nicht oben einzelne Ziele auf den Höhen erkennen können.
But over there, as you will agree, the riflemen had fields of fire. The tanks were also able to recognize their targets at a distance of 2,000 meters. I therefore started the attack very early, at 5 a.m., as you know, to take advantage of the darkness and the bad weather, which would enable us to advance far into these hills you can see here, typical Ardennes terrain, by noon.
Auf diese Höhen, die wir hier auch sehen, alle, das ist ja typisch für die Ardennen, dass wir da schon angelangt sein konnten.
Evaluations and obvious shortcomings became sort of academic on the early morning of December 16th. In this supposed very quiet sector, we suddenly found ourselves hit with an immense artillery barrage that included calibers of guns up to railroad carriage type, landing in all sectors, including the Division CP and Saint-Vith. Immediately after this barrage lifted, it probably lasted about an hour, I started to get reports from my various companies, each one of which was attached to each of the 3 infantry regiments of the 106th Infantry Division. These reports were excited. They were, however, objective. They showed that we were being hit by a fairly massive force.
In the 28th Division's area to the south, the opening guns of the offensive aroused the commanding officer of the 112th Regiment, Colonel Guston Nelson.
Even though we in the Division CP thought we understood that this was a massive attacked, we encountered great difficulty in getting acceptance of this information, or felt we did anyway, through Corps and Army to our rear. I really believe that they thought that we were a young, untried division and were slightly excited. However, this same type of information began filtering back to them from our neighboring divisions, the 99th on our left and the 28th on our right. The seriousness of this situation finally became evident to 8th Corps later in the day, at which point they attached to us primarily the Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division.
Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division was led by General William Hogue, who was preparing an attack in the north that morning when his new assignment reached him.
Later that same day, we were also informed by 1st Army behind 8th Corps, to which we were attached, that the 7th Armored Division would attack through Sanvith to our east, and that we were to hold these routes, which were quite vital and a strategic road net in that area, free for this attack. This promised attack or counterattack by the 7th Armored Division through our position is very critical because it influenced all of the division's decisions from there on out.
Since the 7th Armored Division was to counterattack through Colonel Riggs' position to the east, General Hogue was instructed to attack to the southeast when his armor arrived. There, another regiment of the 106th was cut off. But the 7th Armored Division was headquartered some 60 miles away to the north in Holland. And there was little urgency in the cry for help that finally reached his commander, General Robert Hasbrook.
During the first night of the Battle of the Bulge, the enemy infiltrated between our lines and into our rear areas.
We didn't see very many Germans. Of course, now we know that they were moving in on both sides of us, that we had been almost cut off.
Since the Schnee Eifel is practically covered with trees, the terrain is extremely obscure. The young soldier hears fire from the right, from the left, behind him, and in front of him. Some people advance, others go back. There was quite some confusion, which facilitated our advance through the Schnee Eifel toward Schönberg. I met the first prisoners at noon on December 18th, on my way from the northern part of the Schnee Eifel via Bleialf to Schönberg. I must say they seemed rather confused. The questioning of young people confirmed that this was a division which apparently had been newly assembled, or at least contained a great number of men with no war experience.
Oder zumindest mit einer großen Anzahl von kriegsunerfahrenen Leuten hier in Stellung war.
War die Operation planmäßig angelaufen.
The operation had been initiated according to schedule. The 7th Army, attacking from the Eifel front, gained a considerable amount of terrain. The 5th Panzer Army, advancing north of the 7th Army, had also gained some ground, especially since they had apparently managed to surprise the Americans along the entire front.
Anscheinend auf der ganzen Front gelungen war.
On the morning of the 17th, word reached Sanvith of a German penetration coming from the east toward Colonel Riggs' position.
The division commander asked me to ordered me, as a matter of fact, to set up a defense line astride the Schoenberg-Sanvith road, to hold that road for the promised counterattack to the 7th Armored, and as an escape route for our 2 infantry regiments to the front.
The armor that might have relieved Colonel Riggs, General Hogue's combat command, had passed through Sanvith at dawn, heading southeast, on its mission to attack Winterspelt. The 7th Armored Division had left Holland before dawn but its destination was Bastogne. There, General Hasbrouck arrived well ahead of his columns, only to learn that the trouble was somewhere else.
I proceeded from Bastogne to Saint-Vith and joined General Clark, who had arrived there sometime previously, and we found the situation rather desperate to the east of Saint-Vith. Smoke and noise coming from the woods about 2 miles east of Saint-Vith indicated German tanks were there. And the only American troops between these Germans and the town of Saint-Vith was a company of the 168th Engineers of the 106th Division.
Sometime in December, we were going down this country road, and all of a sudden we come upon this great confusion. Jeeps, trucks, men, equipment, going the opposite way. Well, you stop to think, what are we getting ourselves into?
We arrived at a little town of Poteau, which is a little crossroads Belgian village of about, 10 or 12 small Belgian village farmhouses.
The armored columns, like hundreds, thousands of other troops and vehicles on the 17th of December, was approaching Saint-Vith, Belgium. Converging from every direction, some came in pain and panic, some in cheerful confusion, some in desperate urgency. From the east, battered remnants of the 106th fought back toward friendly lines. From the south, units of the 28th Division were withdrawing before assaults of a magnitude no one could explain. And from north and west, the 7th Armored Division struggled on. Their arrival awaited with mounting impatience by General Clark in Saint-Vith.
Sunday night, we were fighting desperately to get ourselves in a horseshoe arc position around the town. This area was the nearest to the enemy, the eastern approaches, about 2,000 yards east of the town. American troops under the command of the 7th Armored Division attempting to hold the town away from them. I am Colonel Don Boyer, United States Army, at that time Major 38th Armored Infantry Battalion, 17 December 1944.
The first arrivals were the reconnaissance troop of the 7th Armored, which I immediately deployed with their automatic weapons in this skirmish line that we'd established, but placed them on the left side, overlooking the open field of fire, where they could better utilize their automatic weapons. The rest of that day was spent assembling any other support we could find. Included in that support, by the way, were some medium tanks that we were able to secure from the 9th Armored Division.
8 o'clock, Monday morning, 18 December, we were hit with our first attack. The Germans punched a hole in our lines. We counterattacked and restored the lines. 2 tanks knocked out, 1 assault gun destroyed were the enemy losses in this attack. Between 11:30 and 12:30 on that Monday, the Germans again attacked us. At the end of an hour, our lines still held, but we had started the long roll of losses.
The Battle of the Bulge had begun. More than 50 German columns were now attacking through the Ardennes. There were penetrations everywhere. South of Saint-Vith, the 28th Division was split. Chaos ruled to the east, where most of the 106th was surrounded. General von Manteuffel's forces were approaching Saint-Vith itself from 3 sides. At stake was not simply a town, but the timetable of the Ardennes counteroffensive. And it was already 1 irrecoverable day behind. At dawn on the 16th, the massive German assault had achieved its first object, surprise. It had overwhelmed the inexperienced American troops in the forests east of Saint-Vith, where some, like Colonel Oliver Patton, then a Green Lieutenant in the 106th Division, were still trying to fight back to friendly lines on the 18th.
We made a last attack down toward the Schoenberg-Blayoff Road. And in that attack, I was hit for the second time that day. I was hit through both legs and I couldn't walk. Late that night, I remember the battalion commander came through and told us that the battalion had to pull out. They had orders to continue to try to break out back toward American forces. And they were going to leave us. There were 4 or 5 of us in the aid station. They would leave us with a medic.
To the south, the German attack had split the 28th Division, cut off the 112th Infantry of Colonel Guston Nelson. The German attack in this sector was being made by troops of the 5th Panzer Army. The capture of St. Vith with its roads and railways was vital to their advance. They had been expected to take St. Vith on the day before with little resistance, and on the 18th, their commander, veteran General Hasso von Manteuffel, came up himself to see what was delaying their advance.
Ich vermutete, dass es sich doch nur einzelne.
I suspected the presence of scattered, though very courageous forces, which had come here from Saint-Vith or other directions to assist the fighting troops. I was under the impression that up to the 17th and 18th, these small, scattered battle troops were not under centralized command. However, on the evening of the 18th, before nightfall, it became obvious that new enemy forces were approaching.
Machte sich bemerkbar, dass neuere Feindkräfte im Anmarsch waren.
The general's surmise was correct. But American intelligence of the size of the German attack was still so limited that some units of the 9th and then 7th Armored Divisions hastily strung out to extend the American defenses from the original roadblock to a long horseshoe line. We're still unaware that even a little crossroads like Poteau could be vital. There, most troops had already withdrawn when Lieutenant Will Rogers, Jr. woke on the morning of the 18th to word that a German tank was in the street below.
So we raced around to my Jeep to get this bazooka. And the rest was sheer Laurel and Hardy. We couldn't get the strap off because it was covered with mud. Finally, we fought and got the bazooka unstrapped, and then we got it tangled up in some camouflage netting. I was so excited that when I grabbed for the rockets, I took them out, and they dumped and fell down into the mud. Finally, we got everything all set, went down to the edge of this long hedge, and here was a German tank, very thankfully waiting, just right there, waiting for us. We got the bazooka all set, started to fire at this tank, nothing happened. We'd forgot to wire the terminals properly. Finally, we got the terminals wired. We got off one shot at this tank. Big explosion by the tank, but we couldn't see any result. However, the German officer in the tank closed down the turret and slowly backed down out of this little Belgian town of Poteau.
The significance of any threat to the defensive horseshoe was clear to the man who was building it, 7th Armored Division Commander General Robert Hasbrook. The northern front of St. Vith's defenses was being held by the 7th Armored Division's Combat Command B under General Bruce C. Clark.
It became apparent that a command post in the town of St. Vith was too far forward. And so in the afternoon, I sent my aide back around to the vicinity of Krombach to find a place where we could move and move into a room where there were tables and chairs, a place for messengers and liaison officers to park, a room that could be blacked out so we could use it at night.
The defenses east of St. Vith still held. There, Colonel, then Major, Don Boyer was in the point of the horseshoe.
Communications were sparse, but they were sufficient to pass requests for artillery fires and exchange the necessary coordination for the attacks of the various battalions of the division as we received attacks from the Germans and kicked them out with counterattack after counterattack.
Colonel V.L. Boylan was in the horseshoe's northern curve.
I can't recall too many details at that time of specific attacks because it seems that they went on around the clock. And the battlefield is an extremely lonesome place. is not milling with people, you don't see much. You hear things, tanks blowing up, artillery, small rounds, and things like that.
For a private like Bill Dassinger, the battlefield was everywhere.
Minute by minute, things change. I only know what it is to be in just that little hole. Maybe a squad or two around us. That's all we know. We know that little bit of territory that we have.
You were constantly getting rumors. I remember one time we heard that the brightest spot on the Western Front was St. Vith. Many men believed the rumors that different units had pulled out and in turn were panicked. I remember reading one of Jim Thurber's book stories, which is entitled The Day the Dam Broke. And it seemed so apropos to this situation that I asked every member of my staff to read that book and take it to heart.
Continued attacks went on during the day on both of the Combat Command Bs, and my G2 towards the end of the day told me that we had prisoners of war in our prisoner of war enclosure who were identified from 5 German divisions. This seemed impossible to me, but later events proved it to be correct.
The defensive horseshoe was now a good 25 miles long, reinforced by Colonel Nelson's regiment that had lost touch with its division. But the line was being pounded from a horseshoe into a fortified goose egg. Lieutenant Patton knew why. He was riding wounded on the hood of a jeep, driven by a German officer back toward a German aid station.
There were 2 things going on that road that even a lieutenant as green as I was could add up and make sense out of. First thing, of course, was the number of troops moving west along that road, infantry on either side of the road, and the other was the number of vehicles coming down. Tanks, trucks, flak wagons, cars. They were the biggest tanks I'd ever seen in my life. Every time one of those tanks would go by, I'd look at it, and the lieutenant would lean over and look at me and grin.
As I occupied my positions here on the east, on the night of the 20th, 21st, snow flurries in the air, all of us with frostbite, some with frozen fingers and frozen legs. To our front, to our right flank, to our left flank, all night long, we heard the noise of trucks and the noise of tanks moving into position.
At last, the long-delayed, coordinated German attack on St. Vith fell. But General Hasbrook's search for First Army headquarters and his efforts to convince them that he was facing more than a local German counterattack had been successful.
On the morning of the 21st, we were overjoyed to find that the 82nd Airborne had arrived in our general vicinity and had made a tenuous contact with us near the Vilsam Bridge. This was an eventful day in our sector. CCB of the 7th Armored was attacked by a full German corps.
By noon, heavy concentrations of artillery started breaking on the woods in which my forces were located. Screaming Mimi barrages started. These sounded like a huge spring being compressed and then suddenly cut loose. It was a horrible din that came through the air down among the trees.
I remember one unit commander who I had who several times reported to me that he had to be relieved or had to have reinforcements that he could only hold maybe another hour or sometimes 3 hours or sometimes 8 hours. I remember telling him very definitely that, saying, how the hell do you know how long can you hold? You just hold there as long as you have the ability to fire back.
Time meant nothing to me. But between 1200 and 1300 on the 21st until 2300 hours or 11 o'clock that night, I saw my own immediate force, which had been in the neighborhood of 680 men, go to less than 200.
The eastern point in the horseshoe defending St. Vith was now an island defending only itself. There, Colonel Thomas J. Riggs, the 106th Division engineer, whose roadblock had been the town's first defense, still held the road under his original orders.
Knowing that Sanvith now was filled with German troops coming in from the east, the north, and the south, peeled off to the right until we got in the vicinity of the road that led to Prum. And there we broke off into 5- and 8-man groups. I gave them a compass bearing and told them to try to work their way to the west to rejoin General Clark, Combat Command B, where we might continue the fight. For by nightfall, I and the 4 men in my group were prisoners of the Germans. And I realized that in the furious fight in the day before, that I had been wounded, and for me, the world had come to an end at that point.
We could then, in the dawn's light, see that all of the roads leading into Sanvith were full of German troops concentrating on and going through Sanvith. We obviously could not counterattack. I attempted at that time to split them up into patrols so they could attempt to work their way back to the friendly lines, the U.S. lines. We started 2 of these patrols out and watched both of them captured. And shortly thereafter, I was captured with the remainder of the group.
In the afternoon of 21st December, General Clark informed me that the attack on St. Vith was becoming so heavy they would be forced out of that position that evening, and said he would retreat to the west. I agreed to conform with his movement.
The tremendous delay we had suffered so far in my schedule left its mark on the whole Army, in the Central Corps as well as in the southern sector.
Deshalb waren meine Anstrengungen bis zum 22. Dezember dahin gerichtet.
Until December 22nd, therefore, my efforts were concentrated on the coordination of the attack on Sanvith. In other words, the cooperation of all arms, the infantry, the storm guns, the artillery, the tanks, in a final attempt to take Sanvith.
Und Sie sehen, wie groß die Schwierigkeiten waren, diesen Angriff zu koordinieren. Das ist dann erst am 21. 22. gelungen, sodass wir dann Sanvith endgültig in Besitz nehmen konnten. Aber der Zeitverlust war groß und daher die Bedeutung Ihrer Verteidigung von Sanvith.
As I remember the 22nd of December, I remember it as a day of mud and rain and considerable confusion. As you pressed your attack in the morning of the 22nd against our new defensive line in the Krombach area, our forces were driven back, and at the same time, pressure from the north and the south was applied against our flanks. So as a result, by the night of the 22nd, our force was back pretty much in a semicircle around the town of Komatster.
It should be pointed out that when the men were dispersed on the ground, they were like the fingers of a hand. And as they withdrew, as I later pointed out to them, they gained strength by coming back, as the fingers would, in forming a fist. This gave them strength and coordination.
Komatster would be the last defense. From there, General Clark immediately sought an escape route to the west, a dirt road through the woods to Vielsalm. And although the Battle of the Bulge would last for another month, its turning point had been reached. The defense of places like Sanvith had given the Allied armies what they needed, time to rally and regroup. Next morning, the skies were clear. The ground, which had been a sea of slush and mud that would have mired hopelessly the withdrawal of 23,000 men and their thousands of vehicles, was frozen hard.
During the early morning hours of the 23rd, both CCB of the 7th Armored and CCB of the 9th Armored were hotly engaged with the enemy. It was difficult for them to disengage, but also during the day, the 82nd Airborne was attacked from the south. I finally sent a message to General Clark and General Hogue telling them it was imperative that they start their withdrawal. That if they did not start now, they'd be withdrawing into a bunch of Germans instead of into the ranks of the 82nd Airborne Division.
There was no time to issue formal orders or orders under code. So I instructed that the radio to all units under my command be opened up and that the orders would be given in the clear.
General Hasbrouck told me that I would have to withdraw across the Viel-Somme Bridge by noon, or else the bridge would have to be blown because of the pressure of the German army coming in from his flanks. And I directed that the withdrawal would start immediately, and the plan would be that they would withdraw down the dirt wood road on a first-come, first-served basis. This required that I personally direct traffic at the crossroads at Comanster. So I started the battle as the military police, and I ended the battle as the military police. But of course that was necessary.
The withdrawal started at 7 a.m. and went on constantly throughout that day. It went very smoothly, the covering forces operated efficiently, and only one unit had trouble. That was Task Force Jones on the southern flank, the last to withdraw.
So the American column passed through these little towns of Biho and Bovigny, and as they did, they became part of Task Force Jones, which was the rear guard of the American unit coming out of Saint-Vith. And my little platoon became part of the rear guard of the last unit out of Saint-Vith.
As we fell back onto the road to Somme-Chateau, I found it choked with vehicles from a task force of the 7th Armored Division. We attempted to work our way through these vehicles to find out what the trouble was, and we found that there was a burning tank in Somme-Chateau and that the Germans had apparently come around behind us with an anti-tank gun.
In the meanwhile, someone had discovered a side road up a sort of a side canyon that went up this high mountain beside this Somme River. And just then, a beautiful thing happened. A full, bright moon came up over the hills.
We went up this side road and then across country. And in one place, we had to detail some of the tanks of the 7th Armored Division to pull the wheeled vehicles over a highland swamp. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, we finally wound up behind the 82nd Airborne lines.
And we came out through the snow, this brilliant, beautiful moonlight night, and then we saw another wonderful sight. About every 100 feet or so, we saw a man in a white parka standing there, and that was the 82nd Airborne. And we came out through the 82nd Airborne Division, out of the Battle of the Bulge, out of Saint-Vith, and that was Task Force Jones. We were the tail end of the rear guard of the 7th Armored Division.
I climbed up the slope in there where I was greeted by General Hasbrouck, drawn, tired, out on his feet, but still the type of a commander standing there with his troops to the very last minute, threw his arms around me and said, "Boylan, thank God you got him out."
It is the war of the small men, the outpost commanders, the section commanders, the company commanders. Those were the decisive people here who were responsible for success or failure, victory or defeat.
Just 1 month later, in January, you can imagine how we felt, the satisfaction of regaining what we had been forced to lose. There was snow on the ground. Small road leading down to the right, a few farmhouses and trees, and St. Vith itself. No movement, no noise, no dogs, no smoke, lifeless, flattened.
Such is the rush of history that Saint-Vith, Belgium, is almost lost in it now. But not in the memories of those who made history there that winter. or those who must take life up again when history is past.
And then we came back, one by one. The first to return were my father and my elder brothers. But when we came back, things weren't over yet, by far. Everything was destroyed here. That wasn't too bad. Somehow children don't care too much for material values. But the destroyed tanks were a horror. Everywhere, sometimes there were still burned bodies inside. Soldiers, Germans, Americans.
Well, one of the things that's always bothered me most about the Battle of San Vith is that a number of heroic actions went unrecognized and unrewarded. Of course, there were a good many Silver Stars and Bronze Stars awarded because I had delegated that authority to my commanders, and they carried them in their pockets and were authorized to put them on the man at the time. But the higher decorations, which many deserved, were not forthcoming because the sworn statements of witnesses were hard to get in the heat of battle. Afterwards, the witnesses were gone in some cases, and in others, the act was forgotten only too soon.
These are the men who served in the 84th Infantry Division, the division that distinguished itself in a series of critical engagements during World War II. Thus, this story could be the story of any infantry division where the uncommon virtues of courage, endurance, and self-sacrifice became the commonplace. While the Allies made preparations for the crossing of the Ruhr, a major offensive was about to be launched by the combined German forces. The offensive, codenamed Watch on the Rhine, would be more generally known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was Hitler's last opportunity to achieve the initiative on the Western Front, and at least 28 divisions would be engaged in this desperate gamble.
The field that I am on this afternoon is representative of those around Marsh, Belgium that are now being farmed again. In December of 1944, much in contrast, these fields were not being farmed. There were streams of refugees all through the area, again moving out because the intelligence was, or their rumors were, that the Germans again were coming into the town of Marsh. At about 9 o'clock on the morning of the 20th of December, General Bowling, along with a couple of staff officers, an aide, and 4 MPs, went to Verviers, Belgium, where the First Army headquarters was. He asked what the enemy information was, and the only thing they could tell him was it was fluid. Also, he asked for what the mission of the division would be in the Marsh area. He was told that there the division should go into an assembly area.
As the front bulged further westward, the principal road centers of La Ruche and Saint-Vith, Belgium, fell to the Germans. Bastogne was encircled and its capitulation seemed certain. Unless the town of Marsh, Belgium, remained in Allied hands, it seemed probable that the Germans could take the River Meuse and sweep on to Paris. The 84th Division was ordered to withdraw from its positions on the Ruhr and take up a defensive line along the Marsh-Houghton Road.
I'm Major General Bill Sutton, and I was a battalion commander in General Bowling's 84th Rail Splitter Division during World War II. I arrived at the rear CP of the 84th Division in Holland on the 20th of December, 1944, and moved down with the division to Marsh, Belgium on the 22nd of December. To say that the situation was fluid is putting it lightly. In Marsh, Belgium, every other house was occupied by Germans, and there was firing up and down the streets. The 334th Infantry had organized positions along the front edge of the Marsh-Houghton Ridge. I can remember that the foxholes were sometimes 150 yards apart. And they'd been dug in frozen ground, sometimes with the aid of explosives. The position was considerably overextended, and various pockets of German tanks and infantry existed all up and down the line. And during the day, the Germans had infiltrated tanks and infantry into a wooded area back of the front lines and in front of the reserve elements. And they were discovered quite by accident by a small unit going up to reinforce an attack, and they backed off and reported this. The 84th Division Artillery fired on this pocket, which was pretty well defined, and they knocked out all of these tanks and killed several hundred Germans. When the artillery had finished firing, one battalion, I remember the 326, had only 6 rounds of ammunition left. We had other ammunition on the way, but no one knew exactly when it would get there, and it was a rather touch-and-go situation. There are many things imprinted on my mind that will make me always remember the kind of stuff our American soldiers were made of. One incident in particular occurred in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge. We were advancing toward Bale, Belgium, and a mortar shell came in and wounded several men right close around me. There was one man that was almost in arm's reach of me, and I could see that he was hit badly with the back of his head practically blown off, and he was in a state of shock. I tried to comfort the man, prop his head up until the medic could reach him. And all this time, and I shall never forget this man was trying to apologize for me for being hit, and sorry, almost crying, because he would not get to carry on with the battalion and continue the fight.
The Marsh-Houghton line, situated as it was at the extreme tip of the Bulge, received the full weight of the German attack. Chance had placed the fate of this offensive in the hands of an American infantry division. For the men of the 84th, there was no question as to what must be done. The 84th Infantry Division had hurriedly left the Siegfried Line and had taken up defensive positions along the Marsh-Houghton Road. Only by the most heroic resistance would the Allies be able to hold in the flanks of the Nazi salient and keep the enemy line from bulging further westward. This stately chateau, situated at the edge of the village of Verdun, is the property of a Polish baron. During the December fighting, it became a house of horrors, as it was methodically disfigured by some of the bitterest hand-to-hand fighting of the war. A member of the family recalls.
My name is Elizabeth de Radziski, and I spent many days in the castle at Verdun. We witnessed the whole battle, and I was with my father and a few people from the village, and some friends who had come here to find shelter. We spent 5 days and 5 nights in the cellar of the castle. First came the Germans, then Americans. Generally, we could not tell who was in the castle Although we did notice that the Americans wore rubber soles, they walked softly, whereas the Germans, who wore metal tips, were very noisy. Our food consisted of bread, some butter, and ham. The real problem was to get water. We had to walk through corridors where Germans and Americans were often fighting in order to reach the faucet where we could get the water. Sometimes we would meet Americans, sometimes Germans.
A week after the Ardennes offensive had begun, the weather suddenly cleared. Allied air reconnaissance and bombardment was now possible. Although Allied air superiority was complete, the ground fighting remained intense throughout the Bulge. The turning point in the battle for Marche came on December 26th.
It was critically important for the 84th Division to hold the Marche-Hutton Ridge and stop the attack. And only by the determination of the officers and men of the 84th Division and the expert leadership of General Bowling, the division commander, were they able to do this. After the German advance was stopped in the last few days of December, the Germans were noticed to be digging in front of the position, which indicated they did not intend to continue attacking.